The sharp wind swept through the streets of Manhattan, carrying the chill and the golden autumn leaves with it. Inside the imposing office of Blake and Associates, the atmosphere was even colder. Not because of the air conditioning, but because of the tension that hung heavy in the air. The conference room was spacious and modern, with a long dark wooden table at its center and glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city. The metallic glow of skyscrapers reflected on the panels, as if the power of the city itself was watching every move made in that room. Seated on opposite sides of the table were the two grandsons of the late magnate William Blake. On one side sat Ethan Blake, the eldest grandson and owner of a chain of luxury car dealerships. Tall, sharp, and always impeccably dressed, he was the kind of man whose silence said more than words. His gaze was fixed on the attorney, his jaw tight, as if he was prepared for battle. On the other side was Connor Blake, the younger cousin but far from being the wiser one. His suit was perfect, but his smile was anything but clean. It was the smile of a man who had already mapped out his next move. He drummed his fingers on the table, his impatience growing with each second. In the center of the room stood Samuel Wright, the family's longtime attorney. An older man with a weary gaze, he adjusted his glasses and held an envelope sealed with the Blake family crest. Everyone in that room knew what it contained, the final will of William Blake. "Gentlemen," Samuel began, clearing his throat as he carefully broke the seal. The sound of the paper tearing was deafening in the silence. "Let's get to it." He unfolded the paper slowly, adjusted his glasses, and began to read in a steady, firm voice. "I, William Harrison Blake, being of sound mind and full mental capacity, hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." Connor rolled his eyes before the sentence even finished. "Can we skip the formalities, Samuel?" We all know he was as sharp as ever, and twice as controlling. The attorney shot him a cold, steady glance but continued undisturbed. "I hereby declare that my fortune, including properties, shares, business holdings, and investments, shall be inherited by the first of my grandsons to build a legitimate family. To this end, the only and irrevocable condition will be the birth of a biological child by either one of them." Silence. It was as if the whole room had been sucked into a vacuum. Connor leaned forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. He blinked several times as if he had misheard. "What? What did you just say?" The attorney looked directly at him. "The clause is clear, Mr. Connor. The entire fortune will be transferred to the first grandson to have a biological child. There is no room for misinterpretation. This has to be a joke, right?" Connor barked out a laugh, leaning back in his chair. "William must be laughing at us from his grave." But Ethan didn't laugh. He didn't even flinch. His eyes remained locked on the attorney, his face a mask of pure control. He knew his grandfather well. If William Blake had included that clause, it was no mistake. It had a purpose. And deep down, Ethan knew exactly what that purpose was. Samuel's voice remained firm as he read the final part. "If, after a period of 3 years, neither grandson fulfills the condition, the entirety of the Blake family fortune shall be donated to preselected charitable institutions as specified by Mr. William Blake." Connor slammed both hands on the table, the sharp thud echoing through the room. 3 years? He can't be serious. He rose to his feet, pointing a furious finger at Samuel. "You knew about this, didn't you? You knew and said nothing." "I am merely the executor, Mr. Connor," Samuel replied calmly, his tone unwavering as if he'd dealt with far worse tantrums. "My duty is to ensure that Mr. Williams' wishes are carried out to the letter." Connor let out a short, bitter laugh, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. 3 years to have a kid? This is ridiculous. He stopped pacing and turned to face Ethan directly. "You think you can pull it off, cousin? You can't keep a woman around for more than 3 weeks, and you're supposed to start a family." Finally, Ethan moved. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His dark eyes locked on Connor's with the precision of a hunter. "Better to be alone than surrounded by snakes," he said coldly. The jab hit Connor right where it hurt, but instead of lashing out, he smiled. That grin, the one that promised trouble. "We'll see who wins this, cousin," Connor replied, his eyes filled with the glint of someone who had already started scheming. "I'll do it the easy way, while you'll still be sitting here, brooding, trying to find a woman who can stand you for longer than a month." Samuel cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to him. "Gentlemen, I suggest you think carefully before taking any rash action. 3 years may seem like a long time, but trust me, it isn't." He folded the will and stood up. "This meeting is adjourned. Good luck to both of you." Connor was the first to leave, shoving the door open with more force than necessary. But Ethan remained seated for a moment longer. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared at the city skyline beyond the glass. For the first time, Manhattan seemed distant. Later that night, Ethan returned to his luxury penthouse. The silence was louder than the city noise outside. The walls of glass offered a view of the entire city, but inside, it felt like a cage. He shrugged off his suit jacket and threw it over the arm of the leather couch. The glow of the city lights reflected on the ceiling like a living constellation. He sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. He could hear his grandfather's voice in his head. William Blake always had something to say about everything. And one of his favorite lines echoed now, louder than ever. "It's not about how much you have, Ethan. It's about who's there to share it with you." Back then, Ethan had dismissed it as one of his grandfather's old man philosophies. Now, it felt different. The fortune wasn't a reward. It was a test. His grandfather knew him too well. William had known that Ethan, with all his cold logic and calculated decisions, would never willingly build a family. So, he made it a requirement. Ethan could see it clearly now. He also knew Connor wouldn't play fair. Connor would do whatever it took to win. And if there was one thing Connor Blake was good at, it was getting his hands dirty. But the clock had already started ticking. 3 years. 3 years to find a way forward that didn't involve losing himself in the process. "Start a family, huh, old man?" Ethan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "So that's what you wanted." He leaned back on the couch, letting out a long breath. But he didn't sleep. He knew, better than anyone, that intelligence and money wouldn't be enough to win this time. The rain began as a soft drizzle, barely noticeable against the glow of Manhattan's endless lights. It slid down the glass walls of Ethan's penthouse like tiny rivers, distorting the city view. He sat on the edge of his leather couch, fingers pressed together, eyes distant but sharp. The clock was ticking. 3 years. He stood up abruptly, running a hand through his hair, loosening the perfect style he'd worn all day. His footsteps echoed against the marble floor as he paced back and forth, his mind already working, calculating. "A child," he muttered, the word tasting strange on his tongue. "A child, a family, and 3 years to do it." His jaw tightened as he glanced at the city skyline. Out there, in the chaos of Manhattan, Connor was probably already scheming. Ethan could almost hear his cousin's voice in his head, that mocking tone that made his blood boil. "I'll do it the easy way, while you're still thinking," Connor had said. Easy. Ethan knew exactly what easy meant in Connor's world: deception, manipulation, and shortcuts. That wasn't Ethan's style. But what other option did he have? Marriage for love wasn't something he'd ever considered, and love certainly wasn't something you could force on a deadline. He grabbed his coat from the back of the chair and threw it on, fastening the top button as he strode toward the door. His thoughts were racing, but his face was unreadable. No plan comes from standing still, he thought. If he was going to win this, he needed clarity, and maybe, just maybe, the streets of the city would give it to him. Minutes later, the sleek black Aston Martin purred down the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan. The low hum of the engine blended with the sound of rain tapping softly against the windshield. The world outside the window moved in a blur of lights and shadows. Cars sped past, pedestrians darted across crosswalks, and the city pulsed with its usual restless energy. Ethan didn't have a destination in mind. He let his instincts guide him, turning down streets he rarely visited. He passed Central Park, where only the brave or the desperate would wander at this hour. He passed the neon glow of Times Square, where crowds still lingered, seeking the thrill of something bigger than themselves. But none of it pulled him in. At a red light on 47th and Lexington, his eyes wandered to the sidewalk. At first, it was just a glance. But something caught his attention. A woman. She was seated on the cold concrete, pressed up against the side of a closed cafe. Her hair, long and dark, clung to her face, wet from the rain. She wore an old coat, too thin for a night like this, and cradled something precious in her arms. It took Ethan a second to realize it wasn't an object. It was her belly. Pregnant. Her eyes were downcast, staring at the ground in front of her. People passed by without noticing her. No one stopped. No one looked. She didn't ask for help. She didn't raise her hand. She just sat there, her hand gently rubbing her belly in slow, rhythmic circles. The light turned green. The horn of the car behind him blared, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced in the rearview mirror, saw the impatient driver waving him forward. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. He pressed the gas. The Aston Martin rolled forward slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on the rearview mirror, watching her fade into the distance. She didn't move. She didn't even look up. His mind buzzed with questions. "Don't do it," he told himself. "It's none of your business." But a knot had already formed in his chest. Halfway down the street, he hit the brakes. The tires splashed against the wet pavement, and the car jerked slightly as it came to a stop. He sat there, hands on the wheel, the rain tapping softly on the roof. He exhaled slowly, the weight of an unspoken decision pressing on him. With a sharp twist of the steering wheel, he pulled into a narrow alley and turned around. The engine growled as he made his way back toward 47th. He pulled up slowly to the curb, headlights casting a soft glow on the woman. She looked up this time. Her eyes met his, guarded, wary, but not afraid. Ethan stepped out of the car, pulling the collar of his coat up against the rain. His leather shoes splashed in the shallow puddles as he approached her. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said before he could speak. Her voice was low but firm, like someone who'd had to defend herself too many times. "I'm not here to give you any," he replied. She squinted, scanning him from head to toe. Expensive coat. Polished shoes. A watch that could probably pay her rent for a year. "Then what do you want?" she asked, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "To talk," he said plainly. "Yeah, well, I'm not in the mood for conversation," she shot back, pulling her coat tighter around her. Ethan tilted his head, eyes sharp as ever. He crouched down to her level, his coat dripping with rain, but he didn't care. He could see it now, the exhaustion on her face, the resolve in her eyes. This wasn't a woman looking for pity. She was looking for survival. "How far along are you?" he asked, nodding toward her belly. Her hand rested on it protectively, her gaze never leaving his. 2 weeks, maybe less." He nodded, his eyes narrowing in thought. For a moment, he didn't speak, just looked at her like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve. Then, he said it. "I have a proposition for you." Her eyes flashed with disbelief. "Yeah. I bet you do," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. "And I bet it's one of those deals where you win and I lose." "Not this time," Ethan replied. "You get a place to stay. Food. Medical care for you and the baby. Her eyes narrowed even further. "And what do you get?" "A favor," he said plainly. Her gaze didn't waver. She had seen too many favors on the street. Too many deals with too many strings attached. "What kind of favor?" she asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady and calm. "I need people to believe that baby is mine." The words hung in the air, carried by the soft patter of rain. Her eyes didn't move from his face, but he saw it, the slight shift, the moment she realized he wasn't joking. "You're serious," she said, not a question, but a statement. "Dead serious." She shook her head, letting out a short, bitter laugh. "You're crazy, you know that." "Maybe," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "But I'm offering you something you don't have right now." Her eyes flickered to his car. To the warm leather seats she could barely see through the rain-streaked windows. To the man standing before her, with more power in one phone call than most people had in a lifetime. "What's your name?" he asked. "Olivia," she replied, her voice softer this time. "Olivia," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "I'm Ethan Blake. You can look me up if you want." Her eyes widened slightly at the name. Blake wasn't just a name in this city, it was a brand. A legacy. Everyone knew the Blakes. She glanced at him again, suddenly aware of the weight of the offer. "Why me?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more cautious. "Because you didn't ask," he replied. Her breath hitched, and she blinked away the rain on her lashes. For a second, she hesitated. Then, she extended her hand slowly, like she was still deciding if this was a mistake. "One night," she said, locking eyes with him. "If I don't like it, I'm gone." Ethan shook her hand, firm but not forceful. "One night," he agreed. The rain fell harder as she stood, pulling her coat tighter around her. Ethan opened the car door for her, watching as she slid into the passenger seat. For the first time in a long time, he felt something shift. Not a plan. Not a strategy. Something more. He closed the door, glanced up at the rain-soaked sky, and let out a slow breath. "One night," he repeated to himself before getting in the car. But even he knew it wouldn't be that simple. The soft hum of the Aston Martin's engine filled the silence inside the car. Olivia sat in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed straight ahead, her hands nervously rubbing her belly. Her breathing was slow but steady, her eyes flicking toward Ethan every so often, watching him like someone who had seen too many promises broken. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, his hands firm on the wheel, his face unreadable. The glow of the city lights flashed across his face as they passed one street after another. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The rain had eased to a faint drizzle, and the rhythmic tap-tap of droplets against the windshield was the only sound besides the car's quiet purr. "Where are you taking me?" Olivia finally asked, her voice low but sharp. Ethan glanced at her briefly, then turned back to the road. "Someplace warm. Dry. Safe." "Yeah, that sounds nice," she muttered, her voice laced with doubt. Her eyes dropped to her lap, where her hands rested protectively over her belly. "But safe for who? Me, or you?" He didn't answer right away. His jaw tensed for a moment, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "Both," he replied firmly. The rest of the drive was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Olivia didn't trust him, she had no reason to. Ethan wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone who had nothing. Yet, here she was, treating him like he was the one who needed to prove himself. They finally arrived at a sleek, modern high-rise in the heart of Manhattan. The kind of building with a doorman in a pressed uniform and a lobby that smelled like fresh flowers and wealth. Ethan pulled up to the front entrance, and a valet immediately approached, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the Aston Martin. "Mr. Blake," the valet greeted, opening the driver's side door. Ethan stepped out, buttoning his coat as the cool night air hit him. He glanced at Olivia through the window. She didn't move. Her eyes shifted to the grand entrance, taking in the tall glass doors, the golden glow of the chandelier inside, the marble floors so polished they could reflect the whole world. "Let's go," Ethan said, opening her door himself. She hesitated, her eyes darting between him and the entrance. It wasn't fear. It was doubt. The kind of doubt that comes from a lifetime of seeing doors like that close to you. Slowly, she swung her legs out, one hand on her belly as she stood. Her coat, old and too thin, clung to her in the damp air. The doorman's eyes followed her, his gaze lingering a moment too long. Ethan noticed. "Is there a problem, Paul?" Ethan asked, his voice cool but sharp enough to cut. The doorman straightened instantly, his eyes snapping forward. "No, sir. No problem at all." "Good," Ethan said, his gaze like stone. "Because I'd hate to think anyone working for me has a problem with my guests." Paul nodded quickly, his face pale with realization. "Of course, sir. My apologies." Olivia raised an eyebrow, glancing at Ethan as they walked inside. "You sure know how to make people fall in line," she muttered, her voice half impressed, half skeptical. "People forget their place sometimes," he replied. They stepped into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, the space became smaller, quieter. Olivia leaned against the wall, her eyes scanning the mirrored surface of the elevator. Her reflection stared back at her, tired but still standing. She rubbed her belly in slow, methodical circles. "You do this often?" she asked without looking at him. "Pick up strangers on the street and bring them home?" "First time," Ethan replied. She glanced at him, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. "Yeah, right." He turned his head to face her fully, his gaze unwavering. "Believe it or don't. Doesn't matter to me." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she stayed quiet after that. But she kept looking at him, studying him like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open to reveal a spacious hallway with soft lighting and only 2 doors at the far end. Ethan led her to one of them, pulling a small keycard from his coat pocket and tapping it against the sensor. The lock clicked open, and he pushed the door wide. "After you," he said, stepping aside. Olivia hesitated for a moment, glancing down the hallway as if she still had a chance to turn back. But then, with a deep breath, she walked in. Her steps slowed the moment she entered. The apartment was huge, open concept, with glass walls that overlooked the city skyline. The living room was modern but warm, with a large leather sofa facing a massive flat-screen TV mounted on a marble wall. The kitchen gleamed with stainless steel appliances and countertops so spotless they looked unused. For a moment, Olivia stood there, unsure of what to do with herself. Her fingers curled into the sleeves of her coat. "Take it off," Ethan said, his tone more command than suggestion. She blinked, looking at him sharply. "The coat," he clarified, his eyes flicking to her soaked sleeves. "You'll catch a cold if you stay in that." She hesitated but eventually shrugged it off, revealing a plain, worn-out sweater underneath. She glanced around, unsure of where to put it. Ethan stepped forward, took it from her hands, and hung it on a sleek coat rack near the door. "You hungry?" he asked, walking toward the kitchen. "Depends," she replied, folding her arms. "You planning to drug me, or is this a normal meal?" His head turned slightly, and for a second, she thought she saw him smirk. "If I wanted something from you, Olivia, I wouldn't need to drug you." Her eyes locked on his, her stance shifting. "That's supposed to make me feel better." He shrugged. "No. It's supposed to be honest." Her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. But she didn't leave. Ethan opened the fridge, pulling out a few ingredients with practiced efficiency. Eggs. Cheese. Bread. Simple, but real. As he moved around the kitchen, Olivia leaned against the counter, watching him like she was watching a movie she didn't trust the ending to. "You cook?" she asked, her tone half mocking. "I eat," he replied. Cooking was a natural next step. He cracked the eggs into a bowl, his movements quick but precise. For a man who spent his life making million-dollar deals, he was surprisingly good at the little things. "I still don't get it," Olivia said, tilting her head. "Why me?" Ethan didn't look up from the bowl, whisking the eggs with smooth, even strokes. "Because you didn't ask for anything." She scoffed. "That's it? That's your grand reasoning?" He poured the eggs into a hot pan, the sizzle breaking the silence. "It's more than most people give me." Silence fell between them, broken only by the sound of the eggs cooking. Olivia stared at him, her eyes softer now, like she was beginning to understand something she didn't want to admit. "You think helping me makes you a good guy, huh?" she asked, tilting her head. "No," Ethan replied, flipping the eggs. "I think it makes me a smart one." Her eyes lingered on him for a while longer, her gaze softer than before. But she said nothing else. A few minutes later, he slid a plate of eggs and toast in front of her. She didn't hesitate this time. She sat at the kitchen island, picked up a fork, and took a bite. Her eyes closed briefly as she tasted the warmth of real food for the first time in weeks. "Good?" Ethan asked, leaning on the counter, watching her. She nodded once, chewing slowly, savoring it. "Better than it has any right to be." A faint smile tugged at his lips, but it didn't quite form. "Eat. Then rest. There's a room down the hall on the left. It's yours tonight." Her chewing slowed, and she glanced at him with a look of quiet disbelief. "Why are you doing this, Ethan?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. He stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable, his eyes sharper than ever. "Because I need something from you, Olivia," he said finally. "But that doesn't mean I have to be cruel about it." Her gaze lingered on him as she took another bite, her eyes holding something new. Not trust. But maybe something close. Maybe. The soft glow of the pendant lights above the kitchen island cast a golden hue on everything below. The half-eaten plate of eggs sat in front of Olivia, the warmth of the meal still lingering on her fingertips as she traced the edge of the plate absent-mindedly. Her eyes remained on Ethan, watching him with a mix of caution and curiosity. He leaned against the marble countertop across from her, arms folded, his sleeves rolled up just past his forearms. His watch, sleek and expensive, glinted under the warm light. Unlike most men she had met, he didn't feel the need to fill the silence with pointless words. He just stood there, observing her, letting the quiet settle. "You always this quiet?" Olivia asked, her fork idly pushing a piece of egg around her plate. "Depends on the company," he replied, his eyes steady on hers. "Yeah, well, silence makes people uncomfortable," she said, glancing down at her plate. "Sometimes it makes them think too much." "Maybe that's the point," Ethan replied calmly. Her eyes flicked up, and for a second, a smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. "You sound like one of those self-help gurus trying to sell a book." He raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching with the hint of a smile. "If I ever write one, I'll send you a free copy." She let out a short laugh, the kind that slips out before you can stop it. She caught herself, her face growing serious again, but the moment didn't go unnoticed. "You should laugh more," Ethan said, his tone casual but certain. "You should too," she shot back, eyes narrowing in challenge. A quiet hum of acknowledgement escaped him. He tilted his head slightly, like he was seeing her in a new light. She wasn't afraid of him, and she wasn't trying to impress him either. Most people who stepped into his world wore masks, faking charm or confidence to gain something from him. Olivia was raw, and it was as refreshing as it was disarming. She took another bite of eggs, chewing slowly. Her eyes shifted to the massive windows on the far end of the room, revealing the sprawling city skyline. New York at night was endless, buildings flickering like stars, cars snaking through the streets like veins of light. Her eyes stayed on the city for a moment, her face distant. "It looks different from up here," she muttered. Ethan glanced back at the view, then back at her. "How so?" "From down there, it feels like the whole city is trying to crush you," she said, her voice quieter now. "Up here, it's smaller. Quieter. Like it's not so big after all." He watched her closely, noting the shift in her tone. Her guard was lowering, if only for a moment. "The view changes when you're not in the middle of it," he said. "Yeah," she murmured, tapping her fork against her plate. Her fingers paused. Her eyes flicked to him again. "But you've never been down there, have you?" Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan didn't flinch. "I know more about it than you think." She tilted her head, unconvinced. "Knowing it and living it are two different things, Blake." His eyes darkened, just for a second. Not with anger, but with something closer to memory. His gaze drifted toward the window, his face thoughtful, almost distant. "Fair enough," he admitted quietly. Olivia leaned forward, resting her elbows on the counter. "Let me guess. You were born into money, huh? Daddy had a big house, and Mommy had pearls around her neck. You probably had nannies, tutors, and a private school uniform with your initials stitched on the collar." Ethan's eyes met hers again, sharp as ever. "My parents are dead. I was raised by my grandfather." Her teasing smile faded. She sat back, rubbing her hands together slowly, suddenly unsure of what to say. "Sorry." "Don't be," he replied, his tone firm but not cold. "My grandfather taught me everything I know. Some of it useful, some of it, not so much." Olivia nodded, still rubbing her hands. "Yeah, well, life's like that. You learn things you wish you didn't have to." Silence settled again, but it wasn't awkward this time. It felt calmer. Like they had found a middle ground without meaning to. After a few moments, Ethan moved toward the fridge. He pulled out a bottle of water and set it on the counter next to her. She glanced at it, then at him, arching an eyebrow. "What's this for?" she asked. "Hydration," he said, twisting off the cap and handing it to her. "You're eating for two, remember?" Her lips twitched in a half-smile. "Look at you. Caring." "Don't get used to it," he said, but there was no edge in his voice. She took the bottle and drank a few long sips, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. Her eyes stayed on him, studying him the way people study something that doesn't make sense. Like a puzzle piece that doesn't fit where it's supposed to. "You really believe people can change?" she asked suddenly. Ethan's eyes lifted to hers, his expression unreadable. "Depends on what they're changing for." "Money?" she challenged. "Never lasts," he replied. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, her eyes narrowing in thought. She set the bottle down with a hollow thud. "So what are you changing for, Ethan Blake?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the city lights, then back to her. His stare was steady, intense, but not harsh. "Legacy," he finally said. Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Legacy, huh? Sounds like something an old man would say." He exhaled a short laugh through his nose. "Yeah, I guess it does." She shook her head, still half smiling. "Well, if you're trying to leave a legacy, you're doing it the hard way. Nothing worth keeping ever comes easy," he said, his voice low but firm. Her eyes softened for a brief second, just a second. It was hard to tell if it was respect, understanding, or something else entirely. "You sound like someone who's been alone for too long," she said quietly. He tilted his head, his gaze locked on hers. "Maybe I have." Their eyes stayed locked for a moment longer, two strangers who had somehow found themselves on the same path. Then, Olivia yawned, suddenly remembering how tired she was. She stretched her arms and let out a breath, glancing down the hallway. "Still got that room you mentioned?" she asked, already sliding off the stool. "Yeah," he said, pushing himself off the counter. "First door on the left." She nodded, rubbing her eyes like a child on the verge of sleep. As she started walking toward the hall, she glanced back at him. "You cook, you clean, you talk about legacy," she said, smirking. "You sure you're not just a man looking for a family and too stubborn to admit it?" Ethan's eyes met hers, steady as ever. "Good night, Olivia." She let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head as she disappeared down the hallway. Her footsteps were slow but steady. Ethan stayed in the kitchen, leaning against the counter once more, eyes still fixed on the city lights beyond the glass. His reflection stared back at him, unblinking. "Family," he muttered under his breath, tasting the word like it was foreign. It didn't feel like his. Not yet. He glanced down at the plate Olivia had left behind. Half-eaten eggs. A small, simple thing. But it made the empty kitchen feel a little less hollow. He reached for the plate, but stopped himself. Instead, he just stared at it for a while. There was a strange, quiet shift in him. Like something small but heavy had settled in his chest, something he didn't have a name for yet. His phone buzzed on the counter. A message. It was from Connor. "Hope you're ready, cousin. Time's ticking. And I don't wait." Ethan's jaw clenched, but his eyes remained steady. He tapped the screen, deleting the message without replying. "Tick away, Connor," he muttered, turning toward the hallway. "I'm not the one running out of time." Morning arrived quietly. Pale sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan's penthouse, casting long, golden streaks across the polished marble floor. The rain had stopped, and the city below moved like clockwork, taxis honking, crowds surging forward, the world continuing its relentless pace. Ethan stood by the window, a cup of black coffee in hand, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The weight of the night before still lingered on his mind. He had spent hours replaying the conversation with Olivia, her words sticking with him like burrs. "You sound like someone who's been alone for too long." He took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the bitterness ground him. Alone was safer, simpler. Alone didn't come with conditions, expectations, or the chance to be betrayed. But now, he had invited something unpredictable into his world. The soft creak of a door behind him pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Olivia stepping out of the guest room. Her eyes were heavy with sleep, her hair tousled in a way that made it clear she hadn't slept deeply. She rubbed the back of her neck as she stepped forward, glancing around like she had to remind herself where she was. "Morning," she muttered, squinting against the sunlight as she shuffled toward the kitchen. Her gaze lingered on the vast open space, the spotless countertops, and the view of the city below. "This place still looks like a museum." "Better than a street corner," Ethan replied, taking another sip of his coffee. "Touché," she said, smirking slightly. She walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and scanned the contents. Her fingers hovered over a carton of orange juice before she glanced at him, eyebrow raised. "Am I allowed to touch the rich man's juice, or is that off limits?" "Take it," Ethan said without hesitation. She grabbed it, poured herself a glass, and leaned against the counter, taking slow sips. Her eyes stayed on him, curious, searching. "You always this generous?" she asked, tilting her head as she studied him. "No," he replied plainly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Figured," she muttered, smirking into her glass. They stood in comfortable silence for a while. The city moved below them, distant but present, like a hum that never stopped. But the quiet didn't last. A sharp knock echoed through the room, 3 hard raps against the front door. Olivia tensed immediately, her eyes darting to Ethan. Her fingers gripped the glass tighter, her instincts on edge. "Relax," Ethan said calmly, setting his coffee down. It's probably just. The knock came again, louder this time. Ethan's eyes narrowed. His jaw tightened as he moved toward the door, his steps slow but deliberate. Olivia watched him closely, her body shifting as if ready to run if she had to. Ethan unlocked the door and pulled it open just far enough to see who it was. Standing on the other side, looking smug as ever, was Connor. His cousin's grin was sharp, the kind of grin people wore when they already thought they'd won. "Morning, cousin," Connor said, his voice slick with false cheer. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," Ethan replied flatly, gripping the edge of the door. Connor tilted his head, glancing over Ethan's shoulder. "Ha. Looks like you've got company. Didn't think you were the overnight guest type." Ethan didn't budge. His eyes remained locked on Connor, unmoving. "What do you want, Connor?" Connor raised his hands, feigning innocence. "Can't a family member drop by to see how his dear cousin is doing?" His eyes flickered past Ethan, catching a glimpse of Olivia as she leaned just far enough to see who was at the door. His grin widened. Well. Who's this?" "Not your business," Ethan said, his voice colder than the autumn wind outside. Connor's eyes lit up with amusement. "Not my business, huh? I'd say it is. Considering the stakes we're playing for." His eyes flicked to Olivia. "She's pregnant, isn't she?" Ethan stepped forward, blocking his view entirely. "Leave, Connor." Connor's smile didn't falter. He leaned in slightly, his voice low but sharp. "Careful, Ethan. People talk. And if word gets out that you're playing house with a stranger, well, you know how fast reputations can crumble." "Mine won't," Ethan replied, his eyes deadly calm. "But yours might if you keep testing me." For a moment, it was a silent standoff. Two men, one door, and years of rivalry boiling just under the surface. Connor's grin finally faltered, and he stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. All right. No need to get territorial, cousin. I'm just looking out for you." Ethan didn't respond. He just stared at him, unblinking, until Connor took a step back. "See you around, Ethan," Connor said, turning on his heel. "Tick-tock, cousin. Tick-tock." Ethan watched him until he disappeared into the elevator. His hand stayed on the door frame for a moment longer before he finally closed it, turning the lock with a firm click. When he turned around, Olivia was standing in the middle of the room, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp and focused. "That your competition?" she asked, tilting her head toward the door. "Something like that," Ethan muttered, walking back toward the kitchen. He picked up his coffee, took a sip, and leaned against the counter. Olivia shook her head, letting out a short laugh. "You rich people. Always making everything into a game." "This isn't a game," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. She raised an eyebrow. "Sure looks like one." Ethan's gaze locked on hers, more serious than she'd ever seen him. "It's not a game when you have something to lose." Her face softened just a little, her eyes narrowing as she studied him again. "And what are you afraid of losing, Ethan Blake?" His eyes didn't waver. He didn't blink. "Control," he answered simply. That one word hung in the air between them, heavier than anything else that had been said that morning. Control. It was the thread that connected every decision Ethan had ever made. Every business deal, every calculated move, every risk he'd avoided. Control was his armor, and for the first time, Olivia could see the cracks in it. "You know," she said softly, her eyes steady on his, "sometimes control isn't something you lose. Sometimes it's something you give up." Her words lingered in his mind long after she said them. He hated how much sense they made. But he didn't reply. Instead, he drained the last of his coffee and set the cup down with a quiet thud. "Get ready," he said, changing the subject. "We're going out." Olivia raised both eyebrows, surprised. Out. Where? Clothes, he said, grabbing his keys from the counter. You're not walking around in that sweater anymore. Her eyes shifted to the worn-out sweater she'd been wearing since the day before. She blinked, then crossed her arms. I'm fine. You're not, Ethan replied. And I don't do fine. Her lips pressed into a line, her pride and practicality clashing. After a moment, she sighed, tossing her hands up. All right, but I'm picking my own stuff. I'm not wearing any of that rich girl nonsense. Deal, Ethan said, already heading for the door. Minutes later, they were back in the Aston Martin, cutting through the streets of Manhattan. Ethan's eyes stayed on the road, but every so often, his gaze flicked toward the passenger seat. Olivia leaned her head against the window, eyes following the endless stream of people below. Her fingers traced invisible shapes on the glass, her expression thoughtful but distant. She glanced at him, catching him looking. You always stare this much, or am I just lucky? She asked, smirking. Just making sure you don't run, he replied, his tone half teasing, half serious. Her smirk grew into a grin. If I run, you'd never catch me. Don't bet on it, Ethan said, eyes back on the road. The light ahead turned green, and the car eased forward. Neither of them noticed the black sedan parked on the opposite side of the street. Inside, a man sat in the driver's seat, phone in hand, his camera pointed directly at them. He took 2 quick photos. Then he smiled. And the car drove away. The air inside the hospital was sharp with the sterile smell of disinfectant and faint traces of fresh coffee from a nearby vending machine. The world outside might have been chaotic, but here, it felt like everything was frozen in place. Ethan sat in a hard plastic chair, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. His eyes stayed fixed on the large steel doors at the end of the hallway, the words, maternity ward, bold and clear across the top. Every so often, the doors would swing open as nurses or doctors passed through, but none of them were there for him. His suit jacket was gone, draped over the back of a nearby chair. The sleeves of his white dress shirt were rolled up to his forearms, his watch loose on his wrist. His tie hung undone around his neck like he'd been in too much of a hurry to deal with it. His phone vibrated on the seat next to him. He glanced at it. Connor. He ignored it. The only thing on his mind right now was Olivia. It had happened so fast. One moment, they were walking through the aisles of a high-end baby store, Olivia arguing with a saleswoman over the price of a baby carrier. Ethan had been leaning against a display shelf, amused as Olivia pointed out that no baby needed a $400 stroller. Then it happened. Her face had gone pale, and her hand shot to her belly. She let out a sharp gasp, her knees buckling slightly. Ethan was at her side in an instant, his arm around her waist, his other hand steadying her by the shoulder. It's nothing, she had said through gritted teeth, but her breathing had changed, short, shallow breaths. Her fingers dug into his arm. It's nothing. It's not nothing, Ethan had replied, already moving. We're going to the hospital. She didn't argue. He had never driven faster in his life. The rain-slicked streets of Manhattan blurred past them as the Aston Martin darted through traffic. The city lights flashed like streaks of lightning, but all he could hear was Olivia's breathing, sharp and uneven in the seat beside him. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every horn blaring behind him felt like a threat. By the time they reached the hospital, he barely remembered parking the car. He'd helped her through the front doors, her hand gripping his like a lifeline, her eyes squeezed shut against the pain. The nurses had rushed her away, calling for a wheelchair, their voices calm but urgent. Ethan had tried to follow, but one of the nurses stopped him with a hand on his chest. You'll have to wait here, sir, she'd said, her eyes kind but firm. Now, he was still waiting. The seconds felt like hours. His leg bounced restlessly, his knee moving up and down as if it had a mind of its own. His fingers tapped lightly against his chin, his mind playing through every possibility, every outcome. The phone buzzed again. Another message. This time, he glanced at it. "Connor, heard you're at the hospital. Hope everything's going smoothly, cousin." Ethan's jaw tightened. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before he locked the phone and set it face down. He wouldn't give Connor the satisfaction of a response. He leaned forward, his hands rubbing over his face slowly, dragging down to his jaw. He let out a slow breath and forced himself to stay calm. Then, suddenly, "Mr. Blake." He shot up from his seat, his eyes snapping to the nurse who had called his name. Her scrubs were a soft shade of blue, and her smile was calm but knowing. "You can come in now," she said, holding the door open for him. His heart thudded hard in his chest, his legs carrying him forward before he could even think. His steps were fast, purposeful, and each breath felt heavier than the last. The sounds of the hospital shifted as he passed through the doors, the steady beeping of heart monitors, the low hum of medical equipment, and the soft murmurs of nurses exchanging information. His eyes scanned every room as they walked. Then he saw her. Olivia. She was lying in a hospital bed, her head tilted to the side, her eyes half open. Her hair was a mess, her skin glistening with the sheen of exhaustion. But she was breathing. Deep, steady breaths. Her eyes shifted to him as soon as he stepped in, and for a second, something unspoken passed between them. Relief. Recognition. "You made it," she muttered, her voice hoarse but steady. "Of course I did," Ethan replied, walking toward her. His eyes flicked to the small bundle cradled in her arms, wrapped in a soft white hospital blanket. He stopped at the edge of the bed, his eyes focused on the tiny face peeking out from the folds of the blanket. His chest tightened. The baby was small. Smaller than he had imagined. His little face was wrinkled, his eyes shut tight, his hands barely the size of Ethan's thumb. But he was there. Real. Alive. Olivia watched him closely. "You just gonna stare, or you gonna say hello?" His throat felt dry. He swallowed hard, his gaze not leaving the baby. Slowly, he reached out, his fingers hesitant at first, like he was afraid he might break something. But then he touched the soft fabric of the blanket. His fingertips lingered there. "Is he?" Ethan started, his voice quieter than he expected. "Is he okay?" Olivia smiled. Not her usual sarcastic grin. A real smile. Tired but real. "Yeah," she said softly. "He's perfect." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He glanced at her, saw the warmth in her eyes, the pride, the quiet victory that only a mother could have after bringing life into the world. "You want to hold him?" she asked. He blinked, his eyes darting back to the baby. "I don't think." "Come on," she said, adjusting her grip. "I'm not asking." Before he could protest, she gently placed the baby in his arms. His muscles tensed immediately. He had held $100,000 deals in his hands with more confidence than this. But this was different. The weight was light, but it was enough to make his heart feel heavier. He cradled the baby carefully, his eyes locked on that small face. For a moment, everything else faded away, the hospital sounds, the world outside, Connor's voice in his head. All of it disappeared. The baby's face twitched, a small yawn pushing out of his tiny mouth. His little hand curled into a fist, barely brushing against Ethan's chest. Ethan's breath hitched. He didn't know how long he stood there. Time felt like it had slowed to a crawl. "You're a natural," Olivia said, her voice soft but teasing. He glanced at her, shaking his head slowly. "No. I'm not." "Could have fooled me," she replied, leaning back against the pillow. Her eyes drifted closed, exhaustion finally taking over. Ethan looked back at the baby. His arms didn't shake, his grip didn't falter. He stared at the little face, memorizing every inch of it. This is it, he thought. This is the moment everything changes. Not the contracts. Not the deals. Not the inheritance. This. He lowered himself into the chair beside Olivia's bed, still cradling the baby like he was holding something sacred. He glanced at Olivia, her breathing soft and steady as she slipped into sleep. For the first time in a long, long time, Ethan Blake felt something other than control, strategy, and calculation. It was something simpler. It was peace. And as the baby's tiny hand curled around his finger, gripping it tightly, Ethan felt something inside himself unlock. He leaned forward, his voice quiet, like he was sharing a secret. "Welcome to the world, little guy," he murmured, his voice thick with something he didn't fully understand yet. The baby stirred, his face scrunching briefly before he settled again. Ethan glanced at Olivia, asleep but safe. Then, back at the baby, whose grip was still firm on his finger. "You win, old man," Ethan thought, a small, tired smile forming on his face. "You win." The quiet hum of the hospital filled the room like a soft background melody, the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors, the distant chatter of nurses in the hallway, and the gentle hiss of the air vents. It was the kind of atmosphere that could lull anyone to sleep. Olivia was still out cold, her chest rising and falling with the slow, steady rhythm of deep sleep. Her head was tilted slightly to the side, her hair messy but peaceful. For the first time since Ethan met her, she looked completely at ease. No sarcasm. No sharp remarks. Just peace. Ethan sat beside her, his posture relaxed but his eyes far from it. He hadn't moved much since the baby had fallen asleep in his arms. The weight of that tiny, fragile life rested against his chest, the baby's little face nestled into the fabric of Ethan's shirt. His heartbeat was soft but steady, a tiny thrum against Ethan's ribs. He wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting there. Time didn't feel real. Every minute felt like an hour, every hour like a blink. He could feel the warmth of the baby soaking through his shirt, grounding him in a way that no amount of power or wealth ever had. The baby's little fingers were still curled around his index finger, gripping him with surprising strength. Ethan stared at that small hand, his jaw tense, his breathing slow and measured. How could something so small feel so big? His phone buzzed on the chair beside him. The sound felt too sharp for the calm of the room. He glanced at it. "Connor, big congrats, cousin. Everyone's talking. Cute story you've got there. Shame if someone told it wrong." Ethan's jaw tightened. His eyes stayed locked on the message for a moment too long. Then, slowly, he picked up the phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. His first instinct was to reply, but something about the baby's grip on his finger stopped him. He let out a slow breath, locked the phone, and set it down face down on the chair. "You're not going to win this one, Connor," Ethan muttered quietly, his eyes back on the baby. "Not this time." The baby squirmed slightly, letting out a soft whimper. His little face scrunched up as if he were about to cry. Ethan's eyes sharpened with focus, his muscles going stiff. He didn't move right away. Hey, it's all right," Ethan said, his voice low and smooth, like he was closing a delicate business deal. His palm shifted slightly, cradling the baby closer to his chest. "You're fine, little guy. No reason to make a scene." The baby settled, his face relaxing once more. His tiny body nestled deeper into Ethan's chest, his breath soft and steady. Ethan blinked slowly, realizing he'd been holding his own breath. "You're a tough one, huh?" Ethan muttered, glancing down at him. "I can tell already." For a while, he just sat there, watching the rise and fall of the baby's little chest. It felt strange. Not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar. Like standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down, not afraid of falling, but of what might happen if you jumped. The sound of Olivia shifting in bed pulled him from his thoughts. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering open slowly. Her eyes were bleary at first, like she was still halfway between sleep and wakefulness. But the moment she spotted Ethan holding the baby, her lips curled into a small smile. "Look at you," she said, her voice hoarse but playful. "Mr. Stone Cold businessman holding a baby like he's done it his whole life." Ethan glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "Don't get used to it." "Too late," she muttered, stretching her arms with a small wince. "How long was I out?" "Couple hours," Ethan replied, his gaze shifting back to the baby. "You needed it." "Yeah, well, labor will do that to you," she said with a smirk. She tilted her head, watching him with a look she hadn't given him before. Not suspicion. Not doubt. Something softer. "You all right, Blake?" He blinked, glancing at her like he hadn't heard the question. "I'm fine." "Doesn't look like it," she replied, still watching him. "You've been staring at him like he's a puzzle you can't figure out." Ethan tilted his head slightly, his gaze distant for a moment. "Maybe he is." Olivia chuckled softly, leaning her head back against the pillow. "News flash, genius. Babies aren't puzzles. They just need food, sleep, and love. Keep up with that, and you're already ahead of most people." "Simple, huh?" Ethan said, his voice skeptical. "Simple doesn't mean easy," Olivia shot back. Her eyes softened as she watched him. "But you're doing all right so far." They both fell silent for a moment. The baby shifted, his small face nuzzling against Ethan's chest. His breathing remained steady, his warmth soaking into Ethan's skin like a quiet reminder that this was real. "Have you thought about a name?" Ethan asked, glancing at Olivia. She blinked, caught off guard. "A name?" "Yeah," he said, tilting his head toward the baby. "He's gonna need one." Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. She looked at the baby, her face thoughtful, her eyes distant. I don't know. I didn't think I'd have to do it alone." "You're not alone," Ethan said, his voice firm but not harsh. She looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to figure out if he meant it. She searched his face for any cracks, any signs of insincerity. But there were none. "Okay," she muttered, nodding slowly. Her fingers toyed with the edge of the blanket covering her lap. "I always liked the name Leo." "Leo," Ethan repeated, testing the sound of it in his mouth. He glanced down at the baby, his eyes scanning the tiny features of his face. "Yeah. Leo fits." "You think so?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Yeah," he said, his eyes still on the baby. "He's got that look. Like he's already tougher than half the people I know." Olivia laughed, the sound soft but real. She pressed a hand against her forehead, rubbing away the sleep. "Leo Blake. Kinda has a ring to it, huh?" Ethan glanced at her, his eyes steady. "Leo doesn't need my last name to be strong." Her smile faded, replaced with something more serious. Her eyes met his, steady and unblinking. "I know," she said softly. "But maybe it wouldn't hurt." Another knock echoed from the door, this one softer than the one before. Ethan's eyes snapped toward it, his body tensing instinctively. But when the door opened, it wasn't Connor. It was William Blake's former attorney, Samuel Wright. The older man stepped in quietly, his gaze moving from Ethan to Olivia and then to the baby in his arms. His face softened with something close to pride. "Well, I see congratulations are in order," Samuel said, stepping further inside. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded envelope. "I thought I'd stop by to deliver this personally." Ethan's eyes flickered to the envelope. "What's that?" Samuel stepped forward, holding it out to him. "A letter from your grandfather. He instructed me to give it to you on the day your child was born." Ethan stared at it like it might burn him. Slowly, he reached out, taking it with his free hand. The paper was heavier than it should have been, like the weight of all his grandfather's expectations had been crammed into one letter. Samuel gave him a small nod. "Take your time, Ethan. I think you'll find it enlightening." The attorney left quietly, closing the door behind him. Ethan looked down at the envelope. His name was written in his grandfather's sharp, precise handwriting. His chest felt tight, but it wasn't anxiety. It was something heavier. "You gonna open it?" Olivia asked, watching him closely. "Not yet," Ethan muttered, slipping it into his coat pocket. Her eyes lingered on him, but she didn't push. Instead, she leaned forward, resting her head on her hands as she watched Leo sleep. "You know," she said softly, "I think he likes you." Ethan glanced at Leo, his eyes softer than he realized. "Yeah," he murmured, running a thumb gently across the baby's tiny hand. "I think I like him too." And just like that, something shifted. Not a deal. Not a strategy. Family. It was no longer just a word. It was right there, fast asleep in his arms. Sunlight poured into the penthouse like liquid gold, spilling over the marble floors and casting long shadows across the modern furniture. The city below buzzed with its usual energy, but inside, it felt quiet. Peaceful, almost. The kind of peace that only exists in rare, fleeting moments. Ethan stood by the window, his phone pressed to his ear, his gaze focused on nothing in particular. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharp, and his free hand rested on his hip. "No, I'm not interested in negotiations," he said firmly, his voice steady as steel. "Tell the board that if they can't meet the deadline, they can find someone else to finish the job." The voice on the other end stammered something, but Ethan was done. "No extensions," he said, and hung up. He let out a slow breath, his eyes flicking to the reflection in the glass. In the background, he could see Olivia on the couch, cradling Leo. The baby was bundled up in a soft gray blanket, his tiny hand occasionally jerking in that uncoordinated way newborns do. Olivia rocked him gently, her gaze fixed on his face like nothing else in the world mattered. It was a view Ethan hadn't expected to like so much. "Everything all right, Mr. Power and Control?" Olivia called from the couch, glancing at him with a smirk. "Everything's fine," he replied, slipping his phone into his pocket. "People just don't like being told no. Must be hard," she teased, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "Poor millionaires not getting their way." He snorted softly, shaking his head as he walked toward her. Olivia watched him approach, her eyes narrowing with playful suspicion. "You look too calm. What's going on in that head of yours, Blake?" He sat on the arm of the couch, his eyes drifting to Leo, who let out a tiny hiccup. "Thinking." "Yeah, I figured that much," she said, tilting her head. "About what?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "About legacy. About what comes next." Olivia raised an eyebrow, glancing at him. "Legacy, huh? Thought you had that all figured out." "So did I," he admitted, his voice quieter now. He glanced at Leo, his gaze softening in a way that still felt foreign to him. "But plans change." She watched him carefully, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to read a blueprint. "What are you really trying to say, Ethan?" He exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together. "I'm saying I don't care about the inheritance anymore." Silence. Olivia blinked, her brows pulling together in confusion. "What do you mean you don't care?" "I mean, I'm done chasing it," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "The old man wanted me to fight for it. Wanted me to learn something or prove something. But I don't need to prove anything anymore." His gaze shifted to Leo, who was now fast asleep in Olivia's arms. "Not to him. Not to Connor. Not to anyone." Olivia tilted her head, watching him with quiet curiosity. "That's a big statement, Mr. Blake. You sure about that?" "Yeah," he said, nodding slowly. "I'm sure." Her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer before she nodded. "All right, then." Before she could say anything else, the sharp buzz of the penthouse intercom echoed through the room. Ethan's eyes shifted to the wall panel, his jaw tightening. "Expecting anyone?" Olivia asked, glancing at him. "No," he muttered, rising from the couch. He strode toward the intercom, his footsteps solid and purposeful. He pressed the button, his eyes narrowing. "Yes." A familiar voice crackled through the speaker. "Ethan, it's me," Connor's voice came through, smooth as oil. "You gonna let me up, or should I have the front desk call you again?" Ethan's jaw flexed, his teeth clenching for a moment before he pressed the button. "You've got 5 minutes." "Plenty of time," Connor replied, his voice oozing smugness. Ethan turned toward Olivia. Her smirk was gone, replaced with a look of quiet readiness. She adjusted Leo in her arms, her body language subtle but clear. She was prepared for whatever came next. "Is he as charming in person as he is through speakers?" she asked dryly. "Charming isn't the word I'd use," Ethan muttered, glancing toward the elevator. A few moments later, the ding of the elevator echoed through the penthouse. The doors slid open slowly, and Connor Blake stepped out, all swagger and confidence. His suit was sharp, his grin sharper. He walked in like he owned the place, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Olivia and Leo. His grin widened. Well, Connor said, walking in slow, calculated steps. "Look at this picture-perfect little family." His eyes darted to Olivia. "Didn't think you'd settle down so fast, Ethan. She must be special." Ethan stepped forward, blocking Connor's view. "You're wasting your 5 minutes." Connor raised his hands in mock surrender. "Easy, cousin. I'm just here to congratulate you." He smirked, eyes gleaming with that familiar mischief. "You did it. Beat me to the finish line. Grandfather would be proud." Ethan didn't blink. "If that's all you came to say, you can leave." "Not quite," Connor replied, his smile dropping into something colder. "See, I figured you'd want to know something." He tilted his head, his voice dropping into a low, conspiratorial tone. "Word on the street is, people are starting to ask questions. About her." He nodded toward Olivia. Ethan's eyes didn't move. His face didn't flinch. Don't what?" Connor said, his grin reappearing. "I'm just pointing out the obvious. People love a scandal, Ethan. Mysterious woman. Sudden baby. You know how this looks, right?" "I know exactly how it looks," Ethan said, his voice calm but lethal. He stepped closer, just close enough to make Connor shift his weight back slightly. "It looks like you're running out of options. That's why you're here." Connor's smile flickered, just for a second. "Careful, Ethan," he said, his grin tightening. "You're playing a game with people who don't like to lose." "Then they'll hate me," Ethan said flatly. "Because I'm not playing anymore." Connor tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "We'll see about that." He turned and strode back to the elevator, his steps echoing through the room. As the elevator doors began to close, Connor's eyes met Ethan's one last time. "Family's a tricky thing, cousin," Connor said, his voice smooth as glass. "You never know who's really on your side." The doors slid shut, his grin the last thing to disappear. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, his hands shoved into his pockets, his face unreadable. Slowly, he turned back toward Olivia. "Charming," she muttered, cradling Leo closer. "Like a snake," Ethan replied, moving back to her side. He sat beside her on the couch, his eyes fixed on the elevator as if he expected it to open again. After a long silence, Olivia glanced at him. You meant it, huh? What you said about not chasing the inheritance anymore. Yeah, he said, his eyes still on the elevator doors. I meant it. She nodded slowly, glancing down at Leo. Her eyes softened, a quiet calm settling over her face. Good, she said, rocking Leo gently. Because you've already got more than he ever will. Ethan finally looked at her. Looked at them. Her. Leo. His family. For the first time, he didn't feel like he had something to prove. No inheritance. No game. No race to win. He leaned back into the couch, eyes closing slowly as he let the weight roll off his shoulders. Connor could have the fight. He didn't need it anymore. He already had everything that mattered. The steady hum of the private conference room was broken only by the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. The heavy mahogany table stretched across the center of the room like a battleground, polished so perfectly that the overhead chandelier reflected off its surface. The smell of leather-bound books and faint cologne lingered in the air, the unmistakable scent of wealth and power. Ethan sat at one end of the table, calm but deliberate. His hands were clasped in front of him, fingers interlocked, his back straight, his eyes fixed ahead like he was already 2 steps ahead of everyone in the room. He wore a charcoal gray suit, perfectly tailored, and his watch gleamed subtly under the low, golden light. At the other end of the table, Connor leaned back in his chair, one arm draped lazily over the backrest, his legs spread wide in a display of forced confidence. He wore a blue suit that was just a little too flashy for the occasion. His grin was sharp, his eyes flickering with mischief, like he knew something no one else did. Between them, seated with the air of absolute authority, was William Blake's former attorney, Samuel Wright. His presence alone carried weight. His face, lined with years of experience, remained unreadable as he arranged a stack of documents in front of him. Every movement was precise, like a man who never wasted time. Behind them, standing silently, were 2 assistants from the legal firm, their eyes trained on their tablets as they prepared to take notes. This wasn't just a family meeting. It was a reckoning. Samuel tapped the edge of the document stack with his fingers, lining it up perfectly before looking at both men. His gaze moved from Ethan to Connor, sharp but calm. Gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a judge about to issue a sentence. We're here today to settle the terms of William Blake's will and determine the rightful heir to the Blake family fortune. Connor grinned, sitting up in his chair. No need to drag it out, Samuel. We all know why we're here. He leaned forward, his eyes flicking toward Ethan. The rules were clear. First grandson to have a biological child inherits the fortune. And since I'm still without one, he gestured with a flourish toward Ethan. Looks like my dear cousin wins. He clapped his hands slowly, the sound echoing louder than it needed to. Congratulations, Ethan, Connor said, his grin sharp as glass. You played the long game, and you won. Enjoy it while it lasts. Ethan didn't react. His eyes remained steady, locked on Connor like a predator sizing up its prey. Samuel glanced between them, tapping his pen against the table. Before we declare anything official, there's one last matter to address. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a familiar envelope. It was old, worn at the edges, with the unmistakable scrawl of William Blake's handwriting on the front. Both Ethan and Connor straightened. They knew that handwriting. This, Samuel said, holding it up for them to see, is a final letter from William Blake himself. It was to be opened only after the birth of Ethan's child, as per Mr. Blake's instructions. Connor's grin vanished. His eyes sharpened, lips pressing into a thin line. That wasn't part of the will. No, it wasn't, Samuel replied, his eyes on Connor. But your grandfather was known for his foresight. He wanted this moment to be handled properly. Samuel slid a silver letter opener under the seal, breaking it with a quiet, precise tear. The room grew so still that the faint ticking of the clock became deafening. He unfolded the letter slowly, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. To my grandsons, Ethan and Connor. If you're hearing this, then one of you has done what I asked. One of you understood that family is more than blood, and legacy is more than wealth. I knew it would come to this. I knew you'd both fight for it, not because you needed it, but because you thought winning was all that mattered. But I was never interested in which of you could win. I wanted to know which of you could change. Samuel paused, letting the weight of the words settle in the room. Connor shifted in his chair, his eyes darting to Ethan, his fingers tapping anxiously on the armrest. Ethan stayed perfectly still, eyes locked on Samuel, his breathing slow and even. Ethan, if you're holding this letter, then I'm guessing you're the one who changed. I hope you did it for the right reasons. And Connor, if you're still the same man you were when this started, then you've already lost, whether you know it or not. I'm proud of you both, in my own way. But pride alone doesn't build legacies. It's the choices you make from here that will define the name Blake. And as for the money, well, I never cared much for who got it. Because real fortune isn't measured by what you keep. It's measured by what you give. Samuel folded the letter and set it down on the table. The air in the room was heavier now, like everyone was carrying something they didn't know how to put down. Connor let out a short, bitter laugh, rubbing his hands over his face. That's it. That's the big reveal. Change your ways, be a good man, blah blah blah. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You can keep your moral lectures, Samuel. He jabbed a finger in Ethan's direction. You hear me, cousin? None of this changes the fact that you win. Ethan slowly rose to his feet, his eyes on Connor. Calm. Controlled. You're right, Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. I did win. Connor's grin returned, but it was thinner this time, forced. Glad you see it my way. But I'm not taking it, Ethan added, stepping forward until they were face to face. Connor froze, his grin fading into confusion. What? Ethan's eyes didn't waver. I'm not taking the fortune, Connor. You want it so badly. Fine. Take it. Silence. Pure, complete silence. Connor blinked, his head tilting like he didn't understand. Don't play games with me, Ethan. No games, Ethan said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. I don't need it. I don't want it. I've got something better. His eyes flicked toward Olivia and Leo, both of them in the corner of the room, watching everything unfold. Connor followed his gaze, his jaw clenching tight when he saw them. Oh, you think you're noble now? He hissed, his voice laced with bitterness. You think that makes you better than me? No, Connor, Ethan replied, stepping closer until there was barely a foot between them. His eyes were sharp, unyielding. I just stopped letting this place define me. But you? You're still letting it own you. Connor's fists clenched, his nostrils flaring. His pride was crumbling in front of him, and he knew it. Samuel cleared his throat, standing slowly. As executor of the Blake estate, I declare the inheritance will now be transferred to the Blake Charitable Foundation, effective immediately. Connor's head whipped toward Samuel. What? No. No, you can't do that. I can, Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. Because it was Mr. Blake's final wish. Connor's face twisted in rage. I earned that money. No, Connor, Ethan said, turning away from him, walking toward Olivia and Leo. You chased it. That's not the same thing. Connor stood there, breathing hard, his hands trembling with barely restrained fury. You'll regret this, he snarled, his voice low and venomous. But Ethan didn't look back. He crouched next to Olivia, brushing a finger over Leo's tiny hand. The baby gripped his finger tightly, his little face peaceful and calm. I don't think I will, Ethan said softly. He sat beside Olivia, feeling the weight of everything fall away. No more games. No more races. For the first time, the name Blake didn't feel like a burden. It felt like his. The late afternoon sun streamed into the Blake Foundation headquarters, casting long beams of light across the polished hardwood floors. The space was modern but welcoming, sleek glass walls, soft gray furniture, and green plants placed intentionally to bring life into the room. Framed photographs of smiling families lined the walls, each picture a testament to the Foundation's mission, empowering families, changing lives. Ethan stood in front of the largest window, hands in his pockets, his gaze focused on the city skyline. His reflection stared back at him, sharp but calm. This time, he wasn't looking at his reflection to check his control. He wasn't thinking about deals or strategies. He was thinking about legacy. Behind him, soft footsteps echoed. He didn't have to turn to know it was Olivia. Her presence had become as familiar to him as the ticking of a clock, steady, constant, grounding. "You keep staring out that window like it's got all the answers," Olivia said, her voice light with teasing. "Sometimes it does," Ethan replied, his lips curling into a small smile. She walked up beside him, balancing baby Leo on her hip. Leo was wide awake, his big brown eyes taking in everything around him like he was already sizing up the world. His tiny hands gripped Olivia's shirt, his face full of quiet curiosity. "You see all that, kid?" Olivia murmured to Leo, tilting his little face toward the view. "That's your playground now." Ethan glanced at them, his smile softening. "He's going to do something big. I can feel it." "Yeah, well, one step at a time," Olivia said, giving Leo a little bounce. "Right now, he's focused on chewing his own fingers." Ethan chuckled under his breath, his eyes crinkling at the edges. It was a sound Olivia had only heard a few times, but every time it happened, it felt like she'd witnessed something rare and precious. Her eyes flicked to him, her gaze steady. "You sure about all this, Blake?" "About what?" he asked, turning toward her. "All of it," she said, tilting her head toward the glass wall lined with framed family photos. "This whole good guy thing you've got going on. Running a foundation instead of an empire. It's not exactly your brand." He raised an eyebrow. "I don't need a brand anymore." She studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing like she was still trying to crack the puzzle that was Ethan Blake. "You really mean that, don't you?" "Yeah," he said quietly. "I do." Her gaze lingered on him for a beat longer, then she nodded. "All right, then." The sound of a door opening behind them pulled their attention. Ethan turned his head to see Samuel Wright walking in, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. His movements were as measured as ever, every step purposeful. "Glad I caught you both," Samuel said, setting the briefcase on the nearby conference table. He adjusted his tie, glancing at Olivia and Leo with a small smile before focusing on Ethan. "Everything's ready. All that's left is your signature." Ethan moved toward the table, his footsteps slow but deliberate. He glanced at the stack of legal documents that Samuel was laying out. His eyes scanned the headings. Transfer of assets. Restructuring of the Blake Family Trust. Establishment of charitable divisions. "Last chance to change your mind," Samuel said, pulling a pen from his suit pocket. His gaze was sharp but not unkind. "Once it's done, there's no going back." Ethan picked up the pen, turning it slowly in his fingers. He glanced at Olivia, who was now seated on the couch, cradling Leo as she rocked him gently. She didn't say anything, but her eyes met his. There was no doubt in them. No fear. He turned back to the documents, letting out a slow breath. "No going back," Ethan muttered. "That's the point." And then, with a firm, steady hand, he signed his name. Ethan Blake. Samuel watched him with quiet approval. He gathered the papers, stacking them neatly before slipping them back into his briefcase. "Well done, Ethan," Samuel said, his tone sincere. "I think William would be proud." Ethan let out a quiet breath, his eyes on his signature. "For the first time, I think I actually believe that." Hours later, after the office had emptied and the sun had set, Ethan and Olivia found themselves back at the penthouse. It wasn't the same space it had been before. The cold, sterile feeling was gone. It had been replaced with warmth, the subtle signs of life being lived. Baby blankets draped over the edge of the couch. A half-finished mug of tea on the counter. Olivia sat cross-legged on the living room floor, folding tiny baby clothes fresh from the dryer. Leo lay on a soft baby mat nearby, kicking his feet with the wild, joyful energy of a baby discovering his own limbs. Every now and then, he let out a happy squeal, like he'd just accomplished something incredible. Ethan sat on the couch, his tie loose, the top two buttons of his shirt undone. He watched them both like a man watching something he never thought he'd have. "Don't just sit there, Blake," Olivia called, holding up a onesie with tiny lion prints on it. "You can fold clothes, can't you?" "I run a multi-million-dollar foundation," Ethan replied, his tone dry. "You think I've got time for folding?" Yeah, big shot," she said, rolling her eyes. "You're not too important to fold baby clothes." He let out a breathy laugh, shaking his head as he slid off the couch and sat across from her on the floor. He reached for one of Leo's little shirts and stared at it for a second. It was so small it barely covered his hands. "How do you even fold something this tiny?" he muttered, fumbling with it awkwardly. "Here," Olivia said, leaning forward and guiding his hands. "You fold it like this. See?" Her fingers moved with practiced ease, her hands steady but gentle. Ethan followed her movements, his brows furrowed in concentration. When he finally managed to fold one on his own, Olivia gave him a slow clap. "Congratulations, Mr. Blake," she teased. "You've officially leveled up." He glanced at her, his eyes crinkling with a rare, genuine smile. "Feels bigger than my last merger." "Maybe 'cause this one actually matters," Olivia said softly, her eyes locking with his. They sat there for a moment, neither of them speaking. No snark. No jabs. Just two people, folding clothes and watching a baby discover the world one kick at a time. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. "So, now that you're a foundation man and all, what's next for you, Ethan?" He looked at her, his face thoughtful but calm. "Build something real." "Yeah?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Something that lasts," he replied, glancing at Leo as the baby reached for a hanging toy with both hands. Ethan watched him with quiet wonder. "Something that doesn't disappear when the market crashes." Olivia leaned forward, resting her chin on her palm. "Sounds like you're thinking about more than just business." "I am," he said, glancing at her, his gaze steady but soft. "This isn't just about money anymore." She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing like she was still studying him. "Look at you, Ethan Blake. Man of legacy. Man of purpose." He leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "Look at me, Olivia," he said, his voice low but certain. "I'm just a man trying to do right by the people he cares about." Her gaze didn't waver. A slow, genuine smile tugged at her lips. "Yeah," she said softly, her eyes shifting to Leo, who had finally grabbed the toy. "I think you're doing all right." They sat there in silence, folding baby clothes together like it was the most normal thing in the world. No ticking clocks. No deadlines. No races to win. Just life. And for the first time, Ethan Blake realized that he wasn't chasing anything anymore. He wasn't running toward power or away from failure. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. At home. With his family. The sharp ring of Ethan's phone echoed through the penthouse like a warning bell. He glanced at it from across the room, his jaw tightening at the sight of the name flashing on the screen. Samuel Wright. Olivia noticed the shift immediately. She was seated on the couch, bouncing Leo on her knee, her eyes narrowing as she glanced between Ethan and the phone. "That lawyer guy again?" she asked, tilting her head. "Yeah," Ethan muttered, walking over to the kitchen counter where his phone lay buzzing against the marble surface. He grabbed it but didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the screen, his thumb hovering over the green button like he was weighing the cost of whatever was about to happen. "Better rip off the bandage," Olivia said, shifting Leo to her other knee. "He's not calling to wish you a good day, that's for sure." With a sigh, Ethan pressed accept and brought the phone to his ear. "Right," he said curtly. "Ethan," Samuel's voice came through clear, calm but firm. The tone of a man who knew he was about to deliver bad news. "I thought you'd want to hear it from me before it hits the news." Ethan's eyes sharpened instantly. His whole posture changed, back straighter, shoulders squared. News. That one word was enough to make his pulse quicken. "Go on," Ethan said, his tone cold but steady. Samuel sighed quietly on the other end. "It's Connor," he said plainly. "He went to the press." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, pinching the bridge of his nose. Of course, he did. He'd seen it coming, but it still hit harder than it should have. "What did he say?" Ethan asked, his voice controlled but laced with quiet fury. "Everything," Samuel replied. "He claimed Olivia was a random woman off the street you brought in to fake a family and secure the inheritance. He's calling it a Blake family scandal, and the tabloids are eating it up." Olivia froze. Her eyes snapped to Ethan, her smile fading instantly. She didn't need to hear the whole conversation to know. Her grip on Leo tightened, her arms pulling him closer to her chest like she could shield him from something she couldn't see. "Photos?" Ethan asked, his voice as cold as stone. "Several," Samuel confirmed. "One of you walking into the hospital with Olivia, another of you carrying Leo. They've framed it like you staged the whole thing." Samuel's voice hardened. "Ethan, this story is going to spread. You need to be ready for the fallout." "Let it spread," Ethan said, his jaw tight as steel. "I'm done playing defense." "Careful, Ethan," Samuel warned. "This could affect the foundation, your reputation, everything you've built." "I don't care," Ethan replied firmly. He glanced at Olivia and Leo, his eyes locked on them with quiet resolve. "They can say whatever they want. I know the truth. That's all that matters." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Samuel let out a low chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned," the older man muttered. "I guess William was right about you after all." Ethan didn't reply. He hung up, setting the phone down on the counter with deliberate calm. His eyes stayed on it for a second longer, his jaw flexing, his mind already working through the next steps. "Ethan," Olivia's voice cut through his thoughts. Her tone was quiet but firm. "What's going on?" He turned to face her. She was already on her feet, her eyes locked on his like she wasn't going to let him dodge the question. Leo cooed softly in her arms, his tiny face pressed against her chest. "It's Connor," Ethan said, walking toward her slowly. "He leaked everything. The press has pictures of us, the hospital, Leo. He's trying to make it look like all of this," he gestured to her, to Leo, to himself. "Was a setup." Her eyes widened, her mouth pressing into a tight line. Her gaze darted to the window, as if she could see the eyes of the city looking in on them from afar. Her breath came in a slow, steady rhythm, but he could see her fingers gripping Leo just a little tighter. "So, what do we do?" she asked, eyes shifting back to him. "No panic. No fear. Just resolve." Ethan stepped forward, his gaze steady, his voice low and certain. "We tell them the truth." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "The whole truth?" "Every word of it," Ethan replied. "If they want to know who you are, we'll tell them." If they want to know about Leo, we'll tell them. He stepped even closer, his eyes locking with hers. But they don't get to tell our story. We do. Her eyes stayed on his for a long moment, searching for doubt. She didn't find any. She nodded slowly. "All right," she said, her voice strong. "Then let's do it." The conference room of the Blake Foundation was packed. Cameras, microphones, and reporters filled every inch of space. Flashes went off like tiny explosions of light as every news station in the city aimed their attention on the podium at the front of the room. Ethan stood behind it, his face calm but unshakable. He wasn't in a suit this time. He wore a simple black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, his stance strong and grounded. Olivia sat a few feet behind him, her eyes locked on him, her expression steady but watchful. She wasn't here as a bystander. She was here as part of the story. Leo was in her lap, wriggling softly but quiet. Almost like he knew it was time to be still. Ethan stepped forward, placing his hands on both sides of the podium. The room fell into complete silence. All eyes on him. He glanced at Olivia once, just for a second. She nodded. Then he spoke. "My name is Ethan Blake," he said, his voice clear and firm. "And I know you're all here because of the story that's been spreading about me, about Olivia, and about my son, Leo." The room buzzed with flashes and murmurs at the mention of the word son. "Let me make something clear," Ethan continued, his eyes moving slowly across the room, meeting the gaze of every reporter in sight. "You don't get to decide who my family is. I do. Olivia is not a stranger off the street. She's the strongest person I've ever met. Leo is my son. Not because of any will or inheritance, but because I chose him to be. I chose them both." He leaned forward, his eyes sharp as glass. "You want a scandal? Here it is. The scandal is that people like my cousin, Connor Blake, think they can use lies to control the truth. But not this time. Not today." The flashes of cameras went wild. Reporters called out questions, all at once, their voices like thunder. Ethan raised a hand, silencing them. "Ask whatever you want," he said, his eyes hard and unflinching. "But I promise you, you won't find anything more real than what's right here." He glanced back at Olivia and Leo. "This is my family. Write that down." The room buzzed with shouts and questions. "Mr. Blake, are you still eligible for the inheritance? Did you fake the relationship? What do you say to Connor Blake's accusations?" Ethan ignored them. He stepped back from the podium, walking straight toward Olivia. He crouched down beside her, resting a hand on her back as she tilted her head toward him. "Did good, Blake," she whispered, giving him a small smile. "Not done yet," he muttered back. His hand rested lightly on Leo's tiny head, his eyes softening. The flashes continued, but they didn't feel like threats anymore. They felt like the world finally seeing them for who they were. No more lies. No more races to win. No more chasing something that never mattered. This was the story. Their story. And they were going to tell it their way. The low hum of conversation echoed throughout the Blake Foundation's lobby. Reporters had finally cleared out, their voices now reduced to static on TV broadcasts playing on mounted screens around the room. The space smelled faintly of fresh coffee and new beginnings. Ethan stood near the large glass entrance, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. His tie was gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and his posture was looser than usual, but his mind was anything but. Olivia leaned against the reception desk nearby, one arm resting on the counter, the other holding Leo snugly against her chest. Her eyes were locked on Ethan, watching him closely like she always did when she knew something was brewing inside his head. She didn't have to ask. She just knew. "Say it," Olivia finally said, rocking Leo gently as he gnawed on the edge of a teething ring. "Say what?" Ethan asked, his eyes still on the street beyond the glass. Whatever's rattling around in that big brain of yours, she said, smirking at him. I can hear you thinking from over here. He glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. You think you know me that well? Blake, she said, giving him a knowing look. I've seen you pace around the kitchen at 3 a.m. I know all your tells. He huffed a quiet laugh through his nose and shook his head. After a moment, he ran a hand down his face, rubbing his jaw as if the weight of it all had finally settled in. Connor, he muttered, eyes narrowing. Olivia's smirk vanished. Her gaze sharpened instantly. What about him? Ethan turned to face her fully, his eyes serious, his stance firm. He's not done, he said, his voice like cold steel. The press conference embarrassed him. Took away his leverage. People like Connor don't walk away after something like that. Olivia's jaw tightened as she glanced down at Leo, her fingers brushing over his soft curls protectively. So, what do you think he's gonna do? Ethan stared at her for a moment, then exhaled slowly. Something desperate. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts with quick precision. When he reached the name he was looking for, he tapped it and brought the phone to his ear. Who are you calling? Olivia asked. Samuel, Ethan replied, his eyes still focused ahead. If Connor wants to play, we're gonna make sure he knows whose game he's in. The phone rang twice before Samuel picked up. Ethan, Samuel's voice was clear and steady. I assume this is about Connor. It is, Ethan said, his tone all business now. I want eyes on him. Every move he makes. Every person he talks to. Already done, Samuel replied without hesitation. After that press conference, I figured he'd go hunting for a new angle. My people are watching. Good, Ethan muttered, glancing briefly at Olivia and Leo. His gaze lingered on them, and something in his expression shifted, a flicker of something deeper. Resolve. Let me know the second he makes a move, Ethan said. You'll be the first to know, Samuel replied before the call ended. Ethan slid his phone back into his pocket, his eyes thoughtful but focused. Olivia watched him for a moment, her gaze steady. You're not scared, are you? She asked, tilting her head. Scared? Ethan repeated, his brow furrowing. No. But I'm done letting him think he's calling the shots. Her eyes softened at that, a slow smile pulling at her lips. Look at you, she said quietly. Man of legacy. Man of purpose. His eyes flicked to hers, and for a moment, there was something lighter in his gaze. Yeah, he muttered, walking toward her. Something like that. The penthouse was quiet, but not in the way it used to be. It wasn't the cold, hollow quiet of before. It was a warm quiet, the sound of life being lived. The soft whir of the dishwasher in the kitchen. The faint static of white noise from the baby monitor. The gentle rustle of blankets as Olivia settled Leo into his crib. Ethan stood in the doorway of the nursery, one hand resting on the doorframe. He watched as Olivia tucked the soft blue blanket around Leo, her movements slow and gentle. She brushed her fingers through his hair, her face soft with that quiet, steady love only mothers seem to have. Out like a light, she whispered, turning her head slightly to glance at Ethan. He nodded, his arms crossed as he leaned against the frame. You're good at that. Practice, she said, stepping away from the crib slowly, her eyes never leaving Leo. Spent a lot of time taking care of people who couldn't take care of themselves. Yeah, Ethan muttered, his eyes following her as she walked past him into the hallway. He followed her into the living room, where the dim glow of the city lights seeped through the large windows. Olivia flopped onto the couch, letting out a long sigh as she kicked her feet up onto the cushions. Ethan sat beside her, his movements slower, more deliberate. You ever think about it? Olivia asked suddenly, tilting her head to look at him. Think about what? He asked, his eyes flicking toward her. All of it, she said, her eyes scanning the room. If it hadn't been for that day on the sidewalk, you driving by, none of this would have happened. She let out a short laugh, shaking her head. Crazy how one moment can change everything. Ethan leaned back, tilting his head against the cushion as he stared at the ceiling. He thought about it. He thought about that moment, that split-second decision to pull over. He didn't know why he'd done it at the time. Instinct, maybe. Something bigger than logic. Yeah, he murmured, his voice quieter now. Crazy. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt earned, like they'd fought through every storm and finally found shelter. Then, a knock at the door. Both of them froze. Ethan's eyes flicked toward Olivia. She glanced back at him, her eyes suddenly alert, her body shifting like she was ready for anything. Slowly, Ethan rose from the couch, his steps silent but steady. He moved toward the door with the precision of a man who knew he might find trouble on the other side. He glanced through the peephole. Connor. Of course. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He unlocked the door but didn't open it all the way. Just enough to see Connor's face. What do you want? Ethan asked, his voice cold and sharp. Connor's grin was gone. His eyes were bloodshot, his tie loose around his neck like he'd been through a storm of his own. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, his shoulders slouched just enough to signal something different this time. Can I come in? Connor asked, his voice lower than usual. No smug grin. No snark. Just, tired. Ethan glanced back at Olivia, who was now sitting upright, her eyes sharp and alert. She didn't say anything, but her gaze said it all. Be careful. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside, letting Connor walk in. Connor glanced around the room, his eyes scanning the space like he hadn't seen it in years. Nice place, he muttered. His eyes landed on Olivia. His face softened for a moment, then he nodded toward her. Olivia. Connor, she said, her voice cold. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets, shifting on his feet like a man standing on unsteady ground. I'm not here to fight, Ethan, Connor said, his eyes flicking up to meet his cousin's. I'm here because I'm tired. Ethan tilted his head, his gaze sharp but patient. Tired of what? Connor let out a heavy breath, his shoulders sagging like he'd been holding the weight of the world. He glanced down at the floor. Of losing, Connor muttered, his voice cracked with something that sounded a lot like regret. I'm tired of losing. Ethan stared at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then stop playing the wrong game, Ethan said quietly. Connor glanced up, his eyes meeting Ethan's. For the first time in a long time, there was no arrogance in them. Only something that looked a lot like surrender. Connor sat on the edge of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees, his head hanging low like a man who had run out of roads. His fingers laced together, gripping so tight his knuckles turned white. No smug grin. No sharp remarks. Just silence. Ethan stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his eyes sharp as ever. His stance was firm, unyielding, but there was no malice in his gaze. Olivia sat on the arm of the couch, her arms crossed as she watched Connor with a look that hovered somewhere between caution and curiosity. Leo stirred softly in his crib down the hall, his little sounds barely a whisper in the background. The only other sound was the faint hum of the city outside, distant but constant. All right, Ethan finally said, his voice cool but steady. You showed up. You're here. So talk. Connor didn't look up right away. He rubbed a hand down his face, dragging it slowly like he was trying to wipe away something heavier than exhaustion. When he finally raised his head, his eyes were bloodshot, darker than usual, like he hadn't slept in days. I screwed up, he muttered, his voice hoarse but clear. I know I did. Olivia raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. Yeah, well, congratulations on figuring that out, she said, her tone sharp but not unkind. Took you long enough. Connor let out a short, breathy laugh that didn't have any humor in it. He glanced at her, shaking his head. Yeah, I deserve that. You deserve worse, Ethan said, his tone flat. Connor's gaze snapped to him, his eyes narrowing. Don't think I don't know that. He sat back, his hands rubbing his knees like he was trying to work up the courage to say something heavier. I thought I could win. I thought if I played dirtier, hit harder, I'd come out on top. He let out a bitter laugh. But I didn't win, did I? No, Ethan replied bluntly. You didn't. Silence. It stretched out long and heavy, like the weight of everything left unsaid had finally caught up to him. Connor glanced at Olivia, his gaze softer than she'd ever seen it. You think I'm just some spoiled rich kid who never had to work for anything, don't you? Olivia didn't answer right away. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. Am I wrong? Connor's lips pressed into a thin line. No, he muttered, leaning forward again, his elbows on his knees. You're not wrong. He stared down at the floor like it held all the answers. You grow up in this family, and everything's a contest. Who's better? Who's smarter? Who's more ruthless? It's not about family, it's about who wins. He glanced at Ethan, his eyes sharper now, but not angry. Just tired. You know that better than anyone, don't you? Ethan didn't answer. He just stared at him, his jaw tight, his eyes unblinking. Grandfather did it to both of us, Connor continued, his voice growing stronger. He made us fight for everything. Dangle the prize just out of reach, make us jump higher, work harder. We were kids, Ethan. He turned us into competitors before we even knew what family was supposed to be. Olivia glanced at Ethan, waiting for his response. But Ethan didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. Connor leaned forward, his hands pressed together like he was holding something fragile. I thought I had to win, he said quietly, his voice cracking. I thought if I lost, it meant I was nothing. He let out a shaky breath, his eyes closing for a moment. But I lost anyway. And now I see it doesn't matter. His voice was quiet, but the words were louder than any shout. The silence stretched again. Olivia shifted, folding her arms tighter as she glanced at Ethan. All right, she said slowly, tilting her head toward Connor. So now what? You want sympathy? Applause for your big realization? Connor's eyes snapped to hers, and for the first time, there was no hint of anger. Just honesty. No, he said quietly. I want a chance to do better. Her eyes narrowed, skeptical but not dismissive. Better how? He let out a breath, his eyes glancing up toward Ethan. I want in. Ethan's eyes sharpened instantly. His stance shifted just a little, his arms dropping to his sides, fingers flexing slowly. His gaze turned ice cold. In on what? The foundation, Connor said, his voice steady but quiet. I know you don't trust me. I don't blame you. But I'm done chasing the inheritance. I'm done with all of it. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Ethan. I want to work for the foundation. Help with the programs. Do something that doesn't feel like a fight for once. Olivia's eyes flicked to Ethan, watching for his reaction. She didn't say anything, but her fingers tapped lightly against her arm. Ethan tilted his head, eyes narrowing like he was seeing Connor for the first time. Why? He asked, his voice cold but curious. Because I'm tired, Ethan, Connor said, his eyes unblinking. I'm tired of feeling like I have to prove something every day. I'm tired of waking up angry. And I'm tired of feeling like every time I lose more of myself. He let out a slow breath, his voice quieter now, more honest than it had ever been. I just want to feel like I'm worth something again." The room went still. Even Leo's soft cooing had stopped, like he could sense the gravity of the moment. Ethan's gaze stayed on Connor, his eyes sharp but thoughtful. His fingers tapped once against his leg, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Tap. 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 Olivia glanced at him, her eyes narrowed in thought. "What do you think, Blake?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared at Connor, his eyes locked on his cousin like he was weighing him on a scale. Finally, he stepped forward, his footsteps heavy but measured. He stopped right in front of Connor, staring down at him. For a second, nobody breathed. "Get up," Ethan said. Connor's eyes darted up, confused. "What?" "Get up," Ethan repeated, his voice firm but not angry. Connor blinked, hesitating for a second before he stood. He was shorter than Ethan by a couple of inches, but at that moment, it felt like a chasm between them. Ethan stared at him, his eyes cold but focused. Then, slowly, he reached out his hand. "Prove it," Ethan said, his voice quiet but unshakable. "You want a second chance? Prove it." Connor stared at Ethan's hand like it was a lifeline. His eyes flicked to Ethan's face, searching for any sign that it was a trick. But Ethan's face was stone. No lies. No games. Connor swallowed hard. His hand shook slightly as he reached out and clasped Ethan's hand. Their grips tightened, firm and steady, like two men making a deal. "You screw up once," Ethan said, his eyes sharp as glass, "and you're out." "I won't," Connor said, his voice firm. Olivia watched the whole thing unfold from her spot on the couch. Her eyes narrowed slightly, skeptical as ever. But when she glanced at Ethan, her gaze softened just a little. "People don't change overnight," Olivia said, still holding Leo in her arms. Her eyes locked on Connor. "But I've seen crazier things happen." Connor let out a breathy laugh, shaking his head. "You and me both." "Don't make me regret this," Ethan muttered as he let go of Connor's hand. "You won't," Connor said, his voice quiet but firm. "Not this time." Ethan turned away, heading back toward Olivia and Leo. He crouched down beside her, brushing a hand over Leo's head. His eyes softened, his fingers lingering for just a moment longer than usual. "Family's messy," Olivia muttered, watching him closely. "Yeah," Ethan replied, his gaze still on Leo. "But sometimes, it's worth cleaning up." For the first time, it felt like the weight of the past was finally lifting. Not gone. Not forgotten. But lighter. And for Ethan Blake, that was enough. The sky outside the Blake Foundation headquarters had shifted from soft gray to an ominous, deep charcoal. Thunder rumbled low in the distance, vibrating through the glass walls like the warning growl of a beast about to strike. Rain pattered steadily against the windows, blurring the view of the city below. The world outside looked restless, wild, unpredictable. Inside, the tension was no different. Ethan sat at the head of the large conference table, his fingers drumming slowly against the polished wood. His eyes were sharp, his gaze locked on the array of documents spread out in front of him. Bank statements. Employee reports. Contracts. His jaw was set like stone, and the muscle in his cheek twitched every few seconds. Olivia leaned against the doorway, arms folded, her eyes trained on him like she was watching a bomb that might go off at any moment. She wasn't holding Leo this time, he was with one of the trusted Foundation staff in a playroom down the hall. "You keep staring at those papers like they owe you an apology," she said, her tone light but cautious. "They do," Ethan muttered, his eyes not leaving the page. His brows drew together as he leaned forward, his eyes scanning one particular line on the statement. "There's money missing." "Missing how?" Olivia stepped inside, walking toward him slowly. "Foundation funds," he said, tapping the page with the back of his pen. "Small withdrawals. Not enough to trigger any alarms, but frequent. Monthly. Subtle. His eyes flicked to another sheet. It's been going on for a year. Olivia pulled out the chair beside him and sat down, her gaze narrowing as she glanced at the papers. How much are we talking? Close to $500,000, Ethan said, his voice cold and steady, like ice that hadn't cracked yet but was ready to. He tapped his pen against the statement, each tap precise and deliberate. Tap. 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 Her eyes widened slightly. $500,000, she muttered, leaning forward to get a better look. How does that much money go missing, and nobody notices? Because whoever's doing it is smart, Ethan muttered, his eyes scanning another page. They knew just how much to take, just how often, and just how quiet to be about it. He sat back in his chair, tapping the pen on the armrest as his eyes darkened with quiet fury. It wasn't the money itself that angered him. It was the principle. The betrayal. Tell me it's not who I think it is, Olivia said quietly, her eyes flicking toward Ethan. His jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Ethan, she said, leaning forward, her eyes locked on his. Tell me it's not Connor. Silence. Olivia sighed, running a hand through her hair. Of course it is. I don't know for sure, Ethan replied, his eyes distant but focused. Not yet. Come on, Blake, she said, tilting her head toward him. You know it's him. You know it like you know how to tie a tie. Knowing isn't proof, Ethan shot back, his voice sharp but controlled. If I move on him without evidence, he'll twist it. He'll make it look like I'm out for revenge. He leaned forward, his hands on the table, eyes locked on the financial reports like they were a puzzle he was about to solve. I'm not giving him that chance. Olivia studied him for a moment, then leaned back in her chair, arms folded. So, what's the plan, Mr. Legacy? Simple, Ethan said, his eyes narrowing like a hunter locking on his prey. We catch him in the act. The rain poured harder now, slamming against the windows like tiny fists. Lightning flashed, illuminating the skyline for half a second before everything went dark again. Inside the penthouse, the lights were dim, the glow from the fireplace casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. Ethan sat on the couch, his phone in his hand, his eyes fixed on the screen. Olivia sat next to him, her legs folded under her, her eyes sharp and alert. Leo lay in a portable bassinet on the floor, fast asleep despite the thunder outside. Ethan's phone buzzed once. A message. Samuel, got it. Wire transfer request just hit the system. It's him. Ethan stared at the message for a moment, his face unreadable. He exhaled slowly, his fingers curling around the phone like he might crush it. Olivia glanced at him. That him? She asked, already knowing the answer. Yeah, Ethan said quietly, his eyes still on the screen. He tapped the phone, opening a live security feed. On the screen, grainy footage from the Blake Foundation's internal system appeared. It showed a dimly lit office, and sitting at a desk was Connor. He was leaned over a computer, eyes focused on the screen, his fingers tapping furiously on the keyboard. His face was lit up by the glow of the monitor, his eyes darting back and forth as if he knew he was racing against time. Look at him, Olivia muttered, disgust in her voice. After all that talk about wanting to change. She shook her head slowly, letting out a sharp breath. Some people never learn. Ethan didn't answer. He just watched the screen, his eyes locked on Connor. Blake, Olivia said, her voice quieter now. You gonna call the cops? Ethan's eyes flicked to her, cold and calculating. No. Her eyebrows shot up. No. No, he repeated, his eyes shifting back to the screen. Not yet. Then what? She asked, leaning forward. What's the play here? His fingers tapped the phone, sending a quick message to Samuel. Keep the transfer open. Delay it. I'm on my way. I'm going to end it, Ethan said, his voice low and cold. My way. Olivia sat up straighter, eyes narrowing. Your way better not land you in jail, Blake. It won't, he said, sliding the phone into his pocket as he stood. He glanced at her, his eyes steady but firm. This isn't about revenge, Olivia. She raised an eyebrow. No. No, he replied. It's about making sure he never comes back. The office lights were dim, the glow from the emergency exit signs casting eerie red streaks on the walls. The rain still battered the building, a constant hiss of water against glass. Connor sat at the computer, his fingers tapping the keyboard faster now, his eyes darting nervously to the side every few seconds. He was sweating. His suit jacket was tossed over the chair, his sleeves rolled up. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Samuel, wire delayed. Issue with bank security. Connor cursed under his breath, tapping the keys harder. Come on, he muttered. Then, behind him. Click. The sound of a door lock. Connor froze. His breath caught in his chest. Slowly, he turned his head, his eyes wide with panic. Ethan stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his face a mask of absolute calm. His eyes were like granite, cold, heavy, and unyielding. Connor's eyes darted to the computer, then back to Ethan. I can explain, he said quickly, raising his hands like he was already under arrest. It's not what it looks like. It looks like you're stealing from me, Ethan said, stepping inside. His footsteps were slow, methodical. Tap. 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 Connor backed up a step, his chair rolling behind him. It's not what it looks like, he repeated, his voice more frantic now. I need it. Don't, Ethan said, his voice quiet but dangerous. Don't lie to me, Connor. Not again. Connor froze. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. He knew it was over. Ethan stopped a few feet away, his eyes locked on Connor like a predator staring down its prey. Here's what's going to happen, Ethan said slowly, his eyes dark as the storm outside. You're going to walk out that door. You're never coming back. And if I ever hear your name again, anywhere, I'll make sure you don't have a name to use. Connor's breathing was shallow, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. Do you understand me? Ethan asked, his voice low but final. Connor nodded slowly, his eyes downcast. Yeah, he muttered. Yeah, I understand. Good, Ethan said, stepping aside, pointing toward the door. Go. The sun rose slowly over New York City, its golden glow stretching across the skyline like a quiet promise of better days. The rain from the night before had cleared, leaving the world fresh and sharp. Droplets still clung to the edges of street signs and window panes, catching the morning light like tiny crystals. Inside the penthouse, the world moved at a different pace. Slow. Steady. Peaceful. Ethan stood at the kitchen counter, flipping a pancake on a hot griddle. The quiet sizzle of batter hitting the pan filled the air, blending with the soft hum of the radio playing jazz in the background. He wore a plain gray t-shirt and black sweatpants, a far cry from his usual sharp suits. His movements were precise but unhurried, each flip of the spatula done with quiet focus. Behind him, Olivia shuffled into the kitchen, her eyes still heavy with sleep, her hair a tangled mess that she didn't bother fixing. She yawned as she stretched, one arm high in the air while the other rubbed at her eye. You cookin' now? She asked, her voice rough but playful as she pulled up a chair at the island. Is this the new Ethan Blake lifestyle? Pancake chef and humble man of the people. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, raising an eyebrow. Don't get used to it. She smirked, leaning her chin on her palm. Too late. Her eyes shifted toward the living room, where Leo sat on a soft play mat surrounded by colorful toys that crinkled, squeaked, and rattled with every little grab he made. He was sitting up now, his little chubby hands batting at a plastic lion that wobbled but never fell over. Every time it popped back up, Leo squealed in delight, clapping his tiny hands. Olivia smiled softly, her eyes lingering on him for a little longer than usual. "He's getting big," she said quietly. "Feels like he was just a baby yesterday." Ethan flipped the pancake, letting it sizzle for a few more seconds before turning off the burner. He slid the golden brown pancake onto a plate and set it on the island in front of her. "Still as a baby," he said, grabbing a bottle of syrup from the cabinet. "But yeah, I know what you mean." Olivia reached for the syrup, pouring a slow, steady line over the pancake. "Feels like everything's moving faster lately," she muttered, cutting into the pancake with the side of her fork. "Like I blinked, and suddenly, we're here." Ethan leaned against the counter, crossing his arms as he watched her take a bite. His eyes softened, his gaze steady. "That's how it happens," he said quietly. "One day, you're chasing everything. The next, you look around and realize it's all right in front of you." Olivia glanced at him, her chewing slowing just a little. She didn't say anything for a moment, just studied him like she was seeing him for the first time. "Look at you," she said, smirking around her next bite. "All wise and reflective." "Don't start," Ethan muttered, shaking his head, but he smiled. Just as she was about to reply, the faint sound of the door buzzer echoed through the penthouse. Both of them paused, their eyes flicking toward the front door. Olivia raised an eyebrow, setting her fork down. "You expecting anyone?" she asked. "No," Ethan said, already walking toward the intercom. He pressed the button, his eyes sharp and focused. "Yeah." "Mr. Blake," came the familiar voice of Samuel Wright, steady and professional as always. "I'm downstairs. Thought I'd stop by to deliver something in person." Ethan glanced at Olivia, and she gave him a small nod. He hit the buzzer to let Samuel up. A few minutes later, the soft chime of the elevator echoed through the penthouse. When the doors slid open, Samuel stepped out, briefcase in hand, his long gray coat hanging neatly from his shoulders. He adjusted his glasses as he walked toward Ethan, his footsteps steady and deliberate, as if he'd been walking this path his whole life. "Morning, Samuel," Ethan greeted him, his eyes watchful but calm. "Didn't think you made house calls." Samuel smiled faintly. "Only for special clients." He walked to the kitchen island, setting his briefcase on the counter. Olivia leaned forward, tapping her fork against the edge of her plate as she eyed the case. "This feelin' official to anyone else, or is it just me?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Very official," Samuel replied, unlatching the briefcase with a quiet click-click. He pulled out a single manila folder and set it on the counter, tapping it once with his index finger. "This," Samuel said, looking directly at Ethan, "is the final closure on William Blake's estate." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavier than they should have been. Ethan's eyes shifted to the folder, his jaw tightening slightly. He didn't reach for it right away. Olivia glanced between the two men, her eyes narrowing. "That supposed to mean something?" she asked, her tone casual but sharp. Samuel nodded. "It means everything William Blake owned, every piece of his legacy, is officially out of play. All holdings have been transferred. The will is fully executed. And," he said, opening the folder to reveal a neatly typed document, "the inheritance is no longer tied to any conditions." Ethan's eyes flicked up to Samuel. "You saying it's over?" "It's over," Samuel confirmed, his gaze steady. "The game he set up for you and Connor, it's done. No more clauses. No more tests." He pushed the folder toward Ethan. "You're free." Ethan stared at the folder for a moment, his fingers drumming against the counter. Slowly, he reached out, his fingertips resting on the edge of the paper. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He already knew what it said. Olivia leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "So what now?" she asked, watching him closely. "You finally the king of it all?" "No," Ethan said, his voice quiet but certain. He glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm just a man who stopped playing his grandfather's game." She tilted her head, smirking at him. "Good answer, Blake." Samuel watched the two of them, his face softening just a little. "For what it's worth, Ethan," he said, slipping his hands into his pockets, "I think William would be proud of the man you've become." Ethan glanced at him, his eyes thoughtful but firm. "Yeah," he muttered, looking down at the folder. "I think I'd finally agree with you." Samuel nodded once, his gaze lingering on Ethan like he was seeing him as more than just a client. "Take care, Ethan." "You too, Samuel," Ethan replied. The attorney turned and left, his footsteps echoing softly until the elevator doors closed behind him. For a moment, the room was quiet again. Just the sound of the rainwater dripping from the roof and the faint cooing of Leo playing on the floor. Olivia glanced at Ethan, her eyes steady but curious. "So, what are you gonna do now, big shot?" she asked, tilting her head. "No more inheritance to chase. No more legacy hanging over your head. What's next?" Ethan glanced at her, then at Leo, then around the penthouse. His gaze lingered on the toys scattered on the floor, the unwashed mug on the counter, and the tiny blue onesie hanging off the back of the chair. He let out a slow breath, his eyes clearer than they'd ever been. "I'm gonna build something," he said quietly, glancing at Olivia with a look that was stronger than any deal he'd ever made. "But this time, I'm not building it for me." Olivia's eyes softened as she watched him, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. She reached out, resting a hand on his forearm. "Sounds like a plan, Blake," she said, her voice soft but sure. "Sounds like a damn good plan." He looked at her, his eyes steady and sure. No doubts. No hesitation. For the first time in his life, Ethan Blake wasn't chasing anything. He was home. With his family. And that was more than enough.